get going here. Okay.
Wonderful.
Take it away.
Hi, I'm Erin Pelton. I am Vice President of Communications and Public Affairs at Shopify. Just wanted to say thank you to the Bipartisan Policy Center for hosting us today for this discussion. Also, thank you to Congresswoman Glusenkamp-Perez for joining us and for being a champion of small business issues in the Congress. Shopify powers millions of businesses all over the world, helping them start, run, and sustain a business. This week we launched the Shopify Entrepreneurship Index, which we're very excited about. It measures the economic impact of the millions of entrepreneurs in our ecosystem. And the goal of the index is really to provide as much data as possible to those in positions of power so they can make smarter decisions about how to reduce barriers to entrepreneurship. So we're really excited about today's conversation, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Erin, and to Shopify for your support. So I am thrilled to be joined this morning with Congresswoman Marie Glusenkamp-Perez. We are hoping that Congressman Mark Molinaro will join us. I think he's running a little bit late, so as soon as he gets here, we'll just have him grab a seat and go from there. But for now, we've got an amazing freshman member here. She is the 5th-generation Washingtonian who represents Washington State's 3rd District. She is a small business owner and a working mom who serves Southwest Washington's, serves as their independent voice in Congress. She's the daughter of an immigrant and a pastor. And Marie learned by example the importance of working for her community. And for today's purposes, she is a member of the Small Business Committee. Congresswoman, welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So glad to be here.
It's a real honor to have you here. And we were talking a little bit before. I'm glad your first 6 months have gone pretty well.
Yeah, we are excited about the work. I think one thing that has translated from running a small business to Congress is, right, in the automotive industry, you don't get paid up front. You have to know who's going to pay you at the end of the job, and a quick judge of character. And I have been really fortunate to be able to recruit a really amazing staff. So
good.
We have a strong team behind us.
That, as a former Hill staffer, I know that that's the key part for any member. So let's dive into this. So as you mentioned, you and your husband owned and ran a small business. So tell us about how that experience is informing your work in Congress.
Yeah, absolutely. My entire professional career has basically been running an auto repair shop. And, it is, I think we need more small business owners in Congress, especially in the trades. Automotive repair is a stochastic art, right? Like, I can BS all day about whether or not the car runs, but at the end of the day, it does or it doesn't. And I think that sort of level of objective communication, I think, is something that's been really valuable. And it is a really difficult environment for small business owners. We own an independent shop, which is kind of a dying breed, so we're not affiliated with a dealership. And there's been a ton of consolidation in this market. And actually, one of the reasons that I ran for Congress was because of my experience applying for a SBA loan to purchase our building. I spent a year applying for a 504 loan to purchase our building. And it was about, also, I happen to have a degree in economics, right? This application was the size of a phone book. And when you think about the barriers that presents to other business owners, the amount of time it takes to run a business and then to spend this additional time, you can really see why so much of our commercial property is going to the big guys and not staying. And that's really critical, I think, for our communities, because once you start losing your independent businesses, once you lose the pharmacy, once you lose the auto shop, rural towns can start sort of collapsing and losing the ability to sustain an internal economy.
Wow, yeah. So, because you're also on the Agriculture Committee, and with the
right.
Farm Bill coming up, it'll be a great opportunity to kind of address some of those rural development issues as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I was fortunate to be able to get a position as the ranking member for the subcommittee on energy, supply chain, and rural development, and that is a critical piece of our economy. I think that we've spent a lot of time. You might be familiar with the concept of slow food. I think that we need to start adopting a policy of a slow economy. what does it take to build businesses from the ground up, that to build communities and a strong economic foundation. And that's a 20-year project. That takes time. But we've got to start thinking in the long term about what it means to develop workforce, to develop the skills that can't be offshored or taken over by AI.
Yes, well, we have an AI project here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, so we should have a conversation about that later on as well. But there's one topic I did want to touch on real quickly is small business credit. You talked about the loan application you had to do. SBA's 7A loan guarantee program, you're just coming off 2 hearings on that. Can you enlighten the audience a little bit about, first, what is the 7A loan program and where do you think the committee is going to go from here?
Yeah, so those were some pretty spicy committee hearings for anybody who followed those. But they were oriented around the 7A program, which is the wing of the SBA loans that go for capital improvements, equipment. I went through the 504, which is for the physical buildings. So there are changes being proposed in rules around affiliation, which would mean, for the 7A program, a lot of stakeholders have expressed concern that this means that some of these, what I consider to be large loans going to benefit more of the franchisors rather than the franchisees. So things that would work well and I think advance the interest of a smoother application process for the 504 might end up endangering and putting at risk the solvency potentially of some of these loans for the 7A program. So it's they're 2 pretty different programs, and so it's a little bit concerning to see them being painted with a broader brush.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very different needs.
Absolutely.
Okay. So one of our partners today, the partner in today's event is Shopify. As you know, they provide a platform for small businesses and entrepreneurs to establish and operate their companies. In the new Shopify Entrepreneurship Index, New York and Washington have strong rates of job growth and business activity generated by Shopify-supported businesses. What are you hearing about small businesses back in your district? I mean, there's so many pressures on them now from competitiveness, supply chain, workforce. What are you hearing the most about?
Workforce is a huge piece. It's a huge piece. And I think you can't really disentangle from workforce the housing element. So a lot of, during COVID, a lot of our housing stock was bought up. People wanted, or, they're moving out of cities. Housing affordability really took a dive in many of our rural communities. And that means that people haven't been able to recruit a workforce. If you can't find a home there, moving in. So a lot of our rural hospitals, a lot of our mills, a lot of these things that have relied on bringing in, a fresh workforce from outside the community have had a really hard time to recruit. And at the same side, we've seen, a real problem, I would say, with that organic workforce development. I'm part of the generation of students who were all sort of, all of our best shop classes kind of got turned into computer programming classes. We were told that was going to be the job of the future, that we were all going to be computer programmers. And turns out you can teach a computer to do some of that computer programming. Mm-hmm. So there's a little bit, we've got to start pivoting back to supporting career and technical education at the junior high and high school level and start building back up that workforce. That's going to take a real investment. It is expensive to, I understand why schools cut these programs. Like having a 14-year-old under a car lift, there's a lot of liability insurance involved in that.
Yep.
On the other side, so there's like the public education side of it, and then there's the apprenticeship side of it. And one thing that I experienced as a small business owner, I had a 16-year-old kid that wanted to come work in the shop. He was great. This kid was motivated. He was working all the time. You never needed to push him to work. And when I looked at what it would take to bring a 16-year-old in, we could not afford the liability insurance to have a 16-year-old in the shop and start an apprenticeship program. And some of the oversight made my husband very concerned about having the Department of Labor coming over all the time. So what ultimately happened was that a nonprofit stepped in and paid for his liability insurance. And he has been with us ever since. I think it's like 8 years now. He got his citizenship. He bought his first house. These trades jobs are a real path to a solid middle class place in our communities. And so we've got to start doing the work to removing those barriers to having meaningful apprenticeship programs and graduating students who are being encouraged and having their natural talents stewarded and fostered in our education system.
So important. And so Governor Gregoire from Washington was part of our Governor's Council. She's actually now on our Free Speech Project and our Campus Free Expression. Sorry, Jackie. But we did a report years ago about creating multiple pathways, that the four-year college degree was not the answer for everyone, and that we needed these investments in trade schools and different certification programs. And we're still having that conversation, and it feels like we haven't really made much progress toward achieving that. And you come from, it's an interesting state with Washington because you got Seattle with all the tech and the big companies and then in the rural part. So it's it's
interesting. And I think it's maybe a little bit more visible in rural communities where you can see like there is one guy left who knows how to sharpen those saws. And what are we going to do when this 75-year-old finally retires? Like there is a real silver tsunami coming in a lot of these very specialized and critical linchpins in our supply chains. There's institutional knowledge that like has to be passed down, and we are about to miss a really critical fulcrum here if we don't start investing and facilitating these kinds of apprenticeship programs.
So I know you've got to get back there's some early votes today because it's a fly-out day. So one more question for you. What's the one thing you want small businesses to know about how you and your colleagues are working to support them? And for your colleagues who are not small businessmen themselves, what is the one thing they ought to know?
That's a great question. I would say how critical it is that people have got to start showing up in the primary races and elections, and also like lobby your member of Congress. Like if they don't respond to your letters, vote them out. Tell people on Facebook you're not getting responses. People have a lot more agency, I think, than they realize, and that is the thing that it's like we need small business owners to start standing up and listen, I know how much work it takes to run a small business and finding that little extra amount of time to send a letter or lobby. But it's really critical that we have a diversity of stakeholders at the table and lobbying their representatives. And then I think the thing that I, urge my colleagues to understand is that I think that there's often an unintentional lack of respect for the trades. I think that we've unfortunately sort of built this, people love to tell the story of like, my dad was just a janitor and I was the first person to go to college in my family and look at me now, and that's great. Like that is great for you. But I also urge you to say, like, what does that sound like to somebody without a 4-year degree? Mm-hmm. You have just alienated like what you're saying, everything you're saying after that is not, you're not hitting your mark after that. So I, would urge humility and more circumspection about the ways that your bills are influencing rural communities, the trades, and a real, I think people in the trades are very tired of lip service, and we put a lot of energy into listening to the subtext. Outside of a traditionally credentialed, like you don't put a diploma on the wall, you spend a lot of time listening for the social cues of what's going on. And so I would say practicing more circumspection. Yeah.
That's a really good insight, because you do hear that a lot from people, that, the sort of picked up from the bootstraps and
Right.
what that is actually relaying to
Right.
people who,
Right.
who are still in the trades, which, as we all know, you can make as much money doing some trade work.
Selling tires is a lucrative business.
Yes.
I'm here to tell you.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Electricians, like, you can make a lot of money without going to a 4-year
Yeah.
degree, and we need to change that conversation. But I think, with partners like Shopify and folks really focusing on small businesses, and as you talk to members of Congress, almost everybody up there wants to be the champion of small business. So I think your colleagues are going to be open to that conversation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for
It
your
was just
time.
fun.
This was a great conversation. It was nice, just you and me. So I apologize to our audience that Congressman Molinaro got caught up. We'll get him back here some other time. But thank you for your time, and I know you got to get back for some votes. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Rachel Snyderman, who I will note was promoted yesterday very well deservedly to director of our economic policy program. She is a rock star. So come on up, Rachel.
Well, thank you all. We can join. Thank you all for being here today. I'm pleased, and thank you, Michelle and Congresswoman Glusenkamp Perez, for that one enlightening discussion. I think it really, we have had prep calls and shared some questions before this, but I think that conversation, offers just a really helpful starting point for us to think about, as we check the pulse of small businesses and entrepreneurship in America, especially in this time of economic uncertainty. We need to dive into the data. And I think that Shopify's Global Entrepreneurship Index is a really great launching point to begin that conversation. So I want to introduce our wonderful panelists today. We first have Erin Pelton, who is the Vice President of Communications and Public Affairs with Shopify. She is an entrepreneur herself. Prior to joining Shopify, she was with the administration, where she was the Chief of Staff at the Domestic Policy Council and a Special Assistant to President Biden. But prior to that, she co-founded Puerto Rico Live, which was a social enterprise that connected U.S. thought leaders to Puerto Rico, and was also an officer with the U.S. Foreign Service. We also have Anika Hobbs, who founded Nubian Human 10 years ago, which is a Black-owned marketplace that has connected more than 600 emerging artists and brands from 35 countries to promote collective interaction, community development, and global responsibility through a fresh and artistic brick-and-mortar experience. She has rich experiences in multi-level national and international retail trade, and really converged her interests in fashion, interior design, and travel all over the world to create a place that amplifies Black and brown brands, product development, and curated retail experiences. And last but not least, we have John Deary, who is the founder and president of the Center for American Entrepreneurship. He is the former acting CEO of the Financial Services Forum, which is a financial and economic policy organization comprised of CEOs from the largest financial institutions with operations in the United States. And prior to that, John held various roles at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and is the co-author of Where the Jobs Are, Entrepreneurship and the Soul of the American Economy. So thank you all again for being here. I'm really excited to dive into the questions that we have talked about and reflect to on the Congresswoman's remarks. But Erin, I want to start with you. Congratulations on a successful launch of Shopify's Global Entrepreneurship Index earlier this week. And, just want to pick your brain about how this launch came to be, what this data set is going to provide U.S. entrepreneurs and global entrepreneurs, really, right, as they're thinking about building their businesses and really identifying the value that this data can provide them.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I think in my opening, Shopify powers millions of businesses all over the world, and that gives us a really unique vantage point, against which to assess the state of entrepreneurship. I like to think of us as sort of like the operating system behind many of the brands you all know and love. If you've ever had a good experience buying something online, it's probably been powered by Shopify. We power about 10% of e-commerce just in the United States alone. So that sort of global footprint and those millions of businesses give us a really unique insight into the state of entrepreneurship. And for those of you that study this, you know that there aren't a lot of great resources available that are timely, that are comprehensive, and that allow policymakers and people in positions of power to understand what's going on at any given moment. And so that was really the impetus behind us launching this. We really want to democratize, if you will, entrepreneurship, make it more accessible to everyone, and help those in power understand how to make it easier for anyone to start a business and to scale it. And so we're really excited about the index. What we've launched this week is really sort of the first step in the process. We intend to update it quarterly with the insights and the data that we've already made available, but we're also going to layer in more data sets, more analysis, more insights. We're excited with the feedback that we're getting. I think we're eager to hear what kinds of data is useful to policymakers, academicians, think tank experts, et cetera, so that we can truly make this sort of like a one-stop shop for entrepreneurship and a center for excellence in data on entrepreneurship going forward.
Awesome. I'm really excited to see these continued rollouts. And on that point about learning about what type of data is most useful and what really is out there, John, I want to turn to you because you're the data guru in the entrepreneurship space, and want to kind of dive into that point about just what data is out there. What's the state of U.S. entrepreneurship when we're looking at the data that exists, and where do we go to get a handle for the state of American entrepreneurship?
Yeah, well, part of the difficulty in getting that handle on the state of entrepreneurship is there's a lot of disagreement, or at least different views as to what entrepreneurship means. Is it new businesses? Is it new and small businesses? Is it the so-called high-impact, scalable, venture-backed tech businesses? Or is it something more broad? Part of the reason why I really like the Shopify Index is that because it's based on an assessment of the millions of businesses on the platform, you get a quite broad assessment of entrepreneurship. And that's the approach that we generally take at the Center for American Entrepreneurship. We just heard from the congressman about how important it is to not forget about shops like hers. If you've ever spent any time on a shop floor and at a business like that, you know that they work just as hard as everybody else, if not harder. And the U.S. economy, they really are the backbone of the U.S. economy, not taking anything away from or not acknowledging the impact of new businesses and scalable. They play a very unique role in the economy as well. So entrepreneurship is a bit of a vague notion, but there's a lot of consensus around how important it is. The best data at the moment, or historically, comes from the Census Bureau. There are a number of reads on entrepreneurship or new business formation. There's the business application data, of which there has been a tremendous amount of conversation and analysis and sort of head scratching, because after an initial dip as the COVID pandemic set in, or plunge, I should say, initially in the first 3 months of the pandemic, there was an enormous spike, and it jumped to new and historically high levels, and that has persisted even as the economy has opened again. And so there's a lot of head scratching as to exactly what is going on. There's also the business formation statistics, which is sort of a next step beyond the business application. That's when businesses actually incur a payroll liability. So it's a different read on entrepreneurship. And then there's the business dynamics series, also Census Bureau, that is probably the richest data that looks at both new business entrants as well as deaths, and so you get a more dynamic sense as to how long these new businesses are surviving, as well as some other reads in terms of job creation and stuff like that. The problem with that data set is that it's released with a significant lag. So it's a great rear view mirror sort of assessment. So that's why an index like the Shopify Index, I think, is going to be seen as something of real value, because it's current, it's going to be updated on a quarterly basis. It's one of many reads on entrepreneurship, but I think it's going to be important, and it's just another great data point for economists and people like me to, as we constantly try to assess where is American entrepreneurship.
Great. That was going to be one of my follow-up questions, was kind of, what has surprised you as you've worked through the tool. So it's great, exciting to hear that. Anika, I want to turn to you because you're a small business owner. You use Shopify to power your business. First, tell us a bit about your company and what you're up to and what you've built.
Yeah, so we actually started here in DC in 2013, and then we opened our second location in Baltimore. We are Shopify users, which is really, really exciting. So we use it on the POS side and as well online. But we worked with artists from all over the world. We represent Black and Brown artists. And like you said, we've worked with over 650 different artists, designers, creatives from 35 countries and 6 different continents. And so for us, diversity and inclusion is extremely important. But we want buying Black, buying brown as a lifestyle, something to be done, with ease. So that's what we really focus on.
That's amazing. And, I want to dive into the fact that, as a small business owner, there are a plethora of tools out there, especially kind of in the fintech and digital space. And we've seen that while there are a menu of options for folks to take advantage of, that access and take up is not necessarily equal among all small business owners. And so this is an area of research that BPC has spent a tremendous amount of time. It's really looking at the digitalization of small businesses and entrepreneurship, and would love to hear a bit more about how you've used digital products and to grow your business over the past years.
Yeah, we're completely digital. Even though we're in a brick and mortar space, everything is digital. We don't really paper anything. From my accountants, obviously Shopify. One of the things that I always look at also is, does it integrate with Shopify? That's one of the first things that I look at for my business as well. But yeah, I mean, every inventory, scheduling, every aspect that you can probably think of, SOPs, communication, everything is done digitally. I don't like a sticky note and I don't like a piece of paper. But I think what it has helped us do is see our business in real time, which has been great, and also improve efficiencies wherever needed. The integrations help tremendously in order for us to kind of tie everything together and look at the impact of sales and average order values and profit and all sorts of numbers and data that we can kind of pull from that. So being digital definitely has helped my business, and also AI too. We do Shopify also uses AI at this point, but we use it as well. Chat GPT, I'm going to be honest, but it's definitely helped us tremendously.
No, well, that's wonderful. I want to bring in some of the points that Congresswoman Gluesenkamp-Perez brought up, because I think that she really highlighted several of the challenges that small business owners face, that policymakers are trying to tackle, that obviously expose a lot of the data gaps and the knowledge that we kind of need, that small business owners need. And so, from talking about the rural-urban divide or the administrative and regulatory barriers that exist not only to starting a business, but then continuing and just trying to get that year of profit. From each of you, kind of would love to hear, from Shopify's perspective and as a small business owner, and of course, John, with your expertise, can you just speak a little bit to these challenges from your perspectives and how the tool, for example, is trying to really close some of those gaps, and then obviously, please enlighten us with some of these additional challenges, but also the opportunities that can exist.
Sure.
So start, Erin, with you, and then maybe
I'll start, but I'm actually really curious to hear what Anika has to say. I think it's no surprise to anybody in this room that it's been a really rough few years for entrepreneurs and for small business owners, just with the pandemic. Obviously, the supply chain struggles that came associated with that. Inflation is a huge, challenge, I think, for small business owners, at least those that I talk to in the Shopify ecosystem. And then, just the sort of general economic uncertainty of the moment. And I think, that applies to both entrepreneurs here as well as overseas. But I think beyond that macro environment, there are some themes that we hear over and over from entrepreneurs about things that would make their lives a lot easier and make it easier for them to do business. Credit card swipe fees is a big one that we hear. It's really strangling small businesses, particularly as inflation is so high. Their margins are really tight. And so those fees, I think, are really difficult for them to grapple with. And we've talked a little bit about red tape in government and just being able to figure out how to navigate government bureaucracy. That's an area where I think there's a lot of work that policymakers can tackle to make it easier. I think the one that we haven't talked a lot about, but I think won't be a surprise. It's probably the most frequent thing I hear from our business owners is access to capital. I think most people know that. But I think it's an area where there's still a lot more work that can be done. And we hear it in particular in our minority business community. Shopify did a survey a few months ago of Black entrepreneurs. I think it was 61% of them said that this is a major obstacle to them growing their business. More than 50% of them said that they feel like they're playing in an uneven playing field. And so that's something that we want to help tackle. And I think there's lots of room for people in this room to do more work in that regard. But interestingly, they're still really optimistic about the future. And I think we've talked a little bit about the trend lines, like 2021, 2022 were historic years for small business creation in the United States. I think we're seeing that trend continue this year. But it just means that we all in this room have a lot more work to do to make it easier for these folks to succeed.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. Inflation was definitely the number one challenge that I've seen. Just as rising cost of goods happen, that we obviously have to transfer that onto the customer, but interest rates are exorbitant, and it's hard to kind of see that profit year when you have to constantly push your prices, buy less, buy smarter, be more strategic about everything that you do. That's the conversation that a lot of us have, is how do you navigate this space with raising inflation? It also goes into labor costs as well. You want to be one of those businesses, just like Congresswoman Marie said, you want to hire folks so that they can have a great living. You want them to be able to buy their first house or their car or whatever it is like that. But with increasing costs, increasing labor costs, it's hard to do that. So that's a really huge challenge. And you want to be known for paying your people fairly. Like, that is just extremely important. And like you mentioned as well, access to capital. And even when you've kind of gotten past that barrier of being able to get capital, we find that the capital is not, what is provided is not necessarily the same in one community versus another. So, someone else with the same sort of books maybe offered $50,000 compared to $20,000. And just even knowing that it's out there, that that's an option. I think I would say for a lot of Black communities, we're taught not to embrace debt, right? So there's an education there where America is based on debt. So it's kind of like just the learning and understanding how to do business. And I would also say that, like, the last thing is that there's something that you don't know until you get into business, which is, once you become a business owner, you start to realize that your business is not just about working in your zone of genius, which would be amazing. But I never knew that I would have to be like a local advocate, a government advocate, know so much about policy, know who can create change in the policy. So I think there's so much learning and understanding about what it is with being an entrepreneur that you don't really realize, but it's a challenge.
So at the Center for American Entrepreneurship, we understand the danger of being in D.C. and inside the Beltway. And so we get out of D.C. on a regular basis and conduct roundtables around the United States with entrepreneurs. You mentioned the book that I wrote. That book was based on a series of roundtables that I and my colleague, Courtney Gedaldig, at the Financial Services Forum did back over the summer of 2011, completely changed my life and the trajectory of my career. I left the forum, I started CAE, so it is a remarkable experience to sit at a table with 15 entrepreneurs and hear their stories, like yours and like the congressman's. And in fact, I just came back from a small mini conference in Kentucky, in southern Indiana, where there were a number of entrepreneurs, and it just always amazes me. I actually led a panel with 4 entrepreneurs, and it's just inspiring and incredibly reaffirming of how important they are to the country and how inspiring they are. But they do have very unique and specific needs. And I will tell you that when we do these roundtables, the kinds of things that we hear about are exactly what you just talked about. And the way that we structure our agenda is to try to respond to that. So we ask a very simple question: what do entrepreneurs need to thrive? And the answer to that is what we hear at the roundtables and what you're hearing from your entrepreneurs in your survey. They need great new ideas. They need the talent and the capital in order to pursue those ideas. with as few unnecessary or stupid distractions as possible. And that's regulation, that's tax issues, both in terms of rates as well as there are aspects of the tax code that actually are either unfavorable to or actually punish entrepreneurs and the people who invest in them. And so those issues are on our agenda. To your point, we take a very, the unique needs of women entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of color are a central aspect of CAE's work and agenda because, as many of you know, that there has been a broad decline until the spike in new business applications, that there's been a multi-decade decline in entrepreneurship in the United States. That's bad. Well, we want to turn that around. Turning that around requires changes in public policy. That's the basic motivating factor for starting CAE. In order to turn that around, we need much higher rates of participation by women entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of color. So when we helped establish the Senate and the House Entrepreneurship Caucuses in 2019, absolutely insane that they had never existed before, the very first event that we did was a roundtable with women founders, and then the next one was a roundtable with entrepreneurs of color. And you're exactly right. The number one issue that we heard, among a number of issues, but the number one issue that we heard is the standards for access to capital for them are different. We all know the statistics about equity capital. I say equity, I'm including both venture and angel. About 2% of equity capital goes to women in this country. Less than 1% goes to entrepreneurs of color. That is outrageous. It's un-American. It's immoral as far as we're concerned. It's got to change. And in fact, one of our top priorities that we have been working on for about 2 years with a number of black fund managers and entrepreneurs of color is a bill called the Expanding American Entrepreneurship Act that would amend the Investment Company Act of 1940 in ways designed to get more capital to women founders and entrepreneurs of color. That would be an enormous boost to American entrepreneurship, and I would hope that you would see it in your Shopify survey.
You know, one follow-up to kind of connect the dots between what the index is showing us and that in your research across the country. I mean, have you found that access, that inequity, not only, of course, demographically, but also geographically as well?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in terms of, when you examine the disparity in equity capital, you do find that entrepreneurs of color more often turn to banks, and that's where they run into the problem of that the standards are different. And then, of course, if you're, traditionally, entrepreneurship has been thought about both by scholars and observers and by potential financiers as being an urban phenomenon. And so one very interesting and encouraging aspect of the survey results, the initial survey results, is that a third of the activity of Shopify entrepreneurs is happening outside of the cities. And so this is very, very encouraging. We and others have been calling for a diversification, a disbursement of American entrepreneurship outside the cities. It's not an East Coast and West Coast thing. It's an American thing. It ought to be happening in the Midwest and the Southeast and the Southwest, and it is. And I think part of that is because of the pandemic, and everybody got used to and is now demanding remote work, the availability of technological tools to do that remote work. One fascinating comment I heard from the congressman as I was talking to her as we were all getting mic'd up is the importance of internet access. Where she lives, which is the topography is very mountainous, a lot of people don't have internet access. Well, if you don't have internet access, you can't participate in remote work. So these become very, very important aspects or very important priorities in diversifying American entrepreneurship outside of the cities, which I think is a very healthy thing.
No, it's an excellent point. And, Aaron, I want to kind of piggyback off that to you because, given the number of the sheer volume of small businesses that you support across the country, you have this unique vantage point that you can see what's working and really what's not, at the local level. And so would love to hear from you a bit more about Shopify's policy priorities on behalf of small businesses.
Absolutely. So our main focus is to take the advocacy off of the plate of our entrepreneurs so that they can focus on running their businesses and try to represent them as best we can with policymakers. And so our advocacy agenda sounds very similar to some of the things we've already been talking about. Lowering interchange fees, increasing competition in that space. We're supporting the Credit Card Competition Act to that end, for example. Improving online government resources. That's an area where we're having lots of conversations in Washington. Senators Rosen and Capito have introduced the One Stop Shop for Permitting and Licensing Act, I believe it's called, and that would create like one central portal for all permitting and licensing information for people at the state, federal, and local level, because right now it's really overwhelming to figure out. If you have an idea in the shower one morning and you want to start a business, that can be the biggest barrier to actually launching your business, is understanding what those, licensing and permitting requirements are. And so like finding a way to make it easier for people to access those tools in one place, I think is really helpful. There's also some interesting things happening in some of the states that we're following very closely, and also talking with folks in the federal government about how to make it easier for those programs to exist, pertaining to self-employment insurance. So there's a number of states like Oregon, Washington, Delaware, which is our #1 state in the index. Clearly, they're doing something really great to support entrepreneurship. And they're allowing people who are collecting unemployment insurance to start a business while maintaining those benefits, rather than forcing them to get a job with a third party. And we think that's really great, because it's giving people alternate options for their future that don't require them to become an employee necessarily. And so we are, encouraging other states to follow the suit in some of these states, and also to remove obstacles in Washington at the federal level to states replicating these programs. And then we also want to see more modernization of programs at the SBA, some of their grant programs, some of their mentorship programs, to account for the rise in e-commerce. This is obviously a huge section of entrepreneurship in the United States now, but the programs there are still lagging a little bit behind. So we want to see more resources for people like Anika, who have made their business very digital.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more on all of those points. Quick programming note, we are going to be joined with Congressman Molinaro in just a few minutes. Michelle's going to sit down with him again. And so, I just want to offer us really a lightning round as we close up our remarks as a panel, and think about, just the optimism. What's next? Anika, kind of starting with you, what are you most optimistic about the state of American entrepreneurship? What can we get that, where are we headed? And we've talked a lot about the challenges, but what's the opportunity?
Yeah, I think one of the really cool things is that entrepreneurship here is, to me, it's accessible. It's become so easy to just start. It doesn't mean huge, but it's become really easy to start. And I think that's inspiring. I know for me, just, we are a retailer, but we've been able to do so many other things. We do interior design work, we do curation. There's all sorts of other aspects of our business that we're able to get into, which I think is really, really cool. And I think that the opportunity is there. It's vast. And so that makes it really exciting, because there's different forms and ways in which you can look at business, or your own business and entrepreneurship. There is a path there. You can have a lifestyle of entrepreneurship here, which I think is really exciting.
Wonderful. John, same to you.
Well, I think the persistence in the spike in new business applications is very intriguing. I was not among those who initially, and Dane Stengler, your colleague, and I have had lots of friendly arguments about this, as to whether the spike in new business applications was the long-awaited inflection point, the revival of American entrepreneurship. We talk a lot as Americans that entrepreneurship is in our blood. We're risk takers by nature. We want to strike out on our own. And so it was very puzzling, this long 4-decade decline in entrepreneurship, and very concerning, obviously, given the importance of entrepreneurship and innovation, to innovation, economic growth, job creation, et cetera. Every crisis has a silver lining. I think the pandemic did something. There's still a lot of analysis and head scratching going on, but I am now crossing over into the group of folks who are of the view that something's going on, because the spike in new business applications is persisting. Something has been awakened. Those of us of a certain age remember a country song called "Take This Job and Shove It." I think there's something to that, with people have emerged from the pandemic, or they faced their mortality, or whatever it was, that they've decided, damn it, I've had this idea in the shower in the back of my mind for years, and I'm going to do it. That is very encouraging, but I think it'd be wrong for policymakers to look at those numbers, those very encouraging figures, and say entrepreneurship is fine, we don't have to do anything. I think it is a call. It's a call to action. What can policymakers do to support, cultivate, encourage, and really put the wind in the sails of this trend and make the most of it? Entrepreneurship is really the pathway back to the kind of economic growth that we need. I'm of the view, and so are a number of others. The big topic right now is the debt ceiling. Our national debt is a national crisis. I'm of the view the only chance that we have. The arithmetic on spending and taxation is too difficult. The pathway to finally tackling the national debt is we need to get back to growing at 3.5% on a real basis year after year after year, as we did for 55 or 60 years after World War II. Entrepreneurship, thriving entrepreneurship is the pathway back to that kind of growth, and so I'm very encouraged by the initial signs, but policymakers have got to act, and that's why the Shopify Index is so important.
Yeah, well, this was the 1 hour I was not supposed to talk about the debt ceiling today, so we somehow managed to make it happen anyways. But Erin, just final closing remarks.
I don't know that I can add much more than these two. I think though we've talked about some of the challenges, it's really also never been easier to start a business. And whether that's, somebody launching a full-time business or a side hustle with, just an idea that they want to, work on in their spare time, like all of those things are possible. So, it's a great time to be an entrepreneur.
Well, thank you all so much for being here today.
having us.
And I want to welcome back Michelle and Congressman Molinaro.
Yep, I think that's how they got our mic set up. So I'm back. Hi, everybody. This is kind of great. I get to have 2 one-on-one conversations with members of Congress. That doesn't happen all the time. So,
Also question your definition of great.
so as Rachel mentioned, we have been joined by Congressman Mark Molinaro. He was elected to serve New York's 19th congressional district in November of 2022. A native New Yorker, a former mayor, state assemblyman, and county executive. He's a career problem solver who ran for Congress to make upstate New York a better place to live, work, and raise his family. And for today's purposes, he is also a member of the House Small Businesses Committee. So thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here with you. I appreciate you reading the short version of my bio.
Yep, figured we should just get right to it.
Let's go.
So let's talk about all those small businesses in your district. You've spent much of your career in local government and have undoubtedly spent a lot of time with small businesses, understanding their needs and challenges. Tell us how you brought that ground level small business input to Congress.
Sure. Well, I appreciate being here. I think the most important of my local government experience was actually village mayor. So not every state has village governments, but New York does. 1,300 neighbors. We're not all related, but we're very close. And at that level of government, you are really the mediator, moderator, and point of contact for everybody. And so, so interacting with small businesses, the challenges they face keeping Main Street alive. Fast forward to becoming a county executive, I come from a part of the state of New York where we had a single employer, a very large single employer up until the mid-1990s, IBM. In the early mid-1990s, 75,000 jobs leave the Hudson River Valley. The entirety of the Hudson Valley, my home county, was built around that single employer. School districts, subdivisions, community centers, events, the economy built around that employer. And we had to rebuild. And so in the rebuilding, we obviously recognized we needed to diversify the workforce. We needed something more sustainable. We needed a much more diverse ecosystem. And so I will just say to you that those experiences I bring not only to Congress, but to this particular committee. Folks at home kind of laugh, I'm a lifetime elected official. What the hell do I know about small businesses? I know what government does to make life difficult or better for small businesses. 80% of new jobs are created from existing small businesses. Without question, they are the backbone of our local economy. And so what I learned as a county leader and local elected official was, as much as it's nice to have a large employer in a community, the efforts in economic development to go for the big fish, the one big fishing expedition, generally ends in both a disaster and desperation. Rather, supporting the existing small and medium-sized businesses to grow into larger businesses in the community, much more effective. So that meant zoning reform, environmental and permitting reforms. It meant advocating on behalf of small businesses, investing in infrastructure. And now I bring that to the Small Business Committee and to Congress, understanding that we've got to break down those barriers and create the incentives necessary to support small business growth.
Great. So one of the wonderful things about the House is there's plenty of opportunities for leadership. So freshman member, you chair a subcommittee on the committee, and it's focused on, part of it is workforce. Representative Glusenkamp-Perez talked a lot about workforce needs of small businesses. How are you approaching that issue, and what can policymakers do to help small businesses with recruiting and training and retention of their workforce?
So first, we have to start by listening to them, and the challenges of recruitment and retention are significantly different today than they were only 2.5 years ago. And so we recognize a couple things. After the pandemic, in particular, in states like New York, there's just a different mindset, as you all know, a different mindset among employees or potential employees, the gig economy, the ability to piece together small and diverse jobs in order to make ends meet without having to go off to the office or go to a storefront. That's changed. Supply chain issues, inflation, and I'll say candidly, government dependency. I grew up on food stamps, so I feel very comfortable saying that at times the aid and support that government provides sometimes, many times, creates a level of dependency that just disincentivizes returning to or entering or enhancing your place in the workforce. And so we've got to obviously deal with cost and supply chain issues. Are we doing that in the Small Business Committee? Not entirely, but in Congress we ought to. But from the Subcommittee on Innovation and Workforce Development, start by listening, and small businesses will tell you we've got to create a pipeline of those jobs. So longer term, our educational outcomes need to meet our economic needs. And in states like New York especially, we're educating kids for jobs we don't have. We're encouraging young people that there's only one way to be successful, and this has been going on for generations. I encourage young people to get a college degree. I encourage them to invest in their education. But my stepdad, I use this example all the time, is a brilliant mathematician, great engineer, and quite frankly, could problem solve anything so long as his head is under the hood of a car. Test him, put him in a classroom, not successful. Tell him the only way to be successful is to be tested. It's demoralizing. We've got to break that framework to encourage from preschool to high school graduation, vocational, applied science, life science, that there are multiple paths to success. You define them, and we ought to incentivize it. That will help small businesses. In the meantime, we've got to be more creative, allowing small businesses not necessarily to have to function in the one-size-fits-all workplace. And so that means confronting state and local federal regulation that sometimes makes it a little difficult for that to happen. I've sponsored a handful of bills to sort of enhance the pipeline, apprenticeship opportunities and internship opportunities, sort of the hands-on approach to try to get, in particular, young people or older folks who want to re-enter the workforce into that. The last I'll mention to you, and it's important to me personally, 80% of those with intellectual, physical, and developmental disabilities are unemployed. 80%. There are millions of Americans who are neurodivergent, maybe have a physical disability, maybe have some intellectual or developmental disability, that if we were to redefine job descriptions, if we were to break down some of the government regulation and incentivize hiring those individuals, like my daughter, this is an opportunity not only to grow the workforce, but to really encourage people who have never experienced the benefit of earning a paycheck and coming home or going to a job where they feel fulfilled. That is something we ought to also invest in. And then I'll say lastly, I'm like a Baptist preacher, lastly, there are those with mental health, maybe returning from service, military service, or re-entering the community from an incarcerated setting. Mm-hmm. Creating the pathway and then the wraparound support necessary to re-enter or enter the workforce for those populations, important as well, which we're focused on.
Well, you make some really great points, and I know because you're on the Transportation Committee, you're on the Agriculture Committee. Those stakeholder groups, industries are also experiencing a huge retirement. We are going to need workers for pretty much every industry out there, and you make a really good point that we need to think outside the box. And certainly, college is great, but it's not what's needed for everyone.
We heard during the pandemic how we were going, this is a new world, we're going to reimagine everything. That's just bullcrap. We didn't reimagine anything, and we're going right back to the same old stodgy ways of doing most of what we do in government. Now, I'm not saying that I liked the reimagine, restart, all that. I mean, I lived through it. You know, I was a frontline responder during the pandemic. But there is some truth to it, and we ought to, as government, federal, state, local, really rethink some of the regulatory structure that we've created, the dependency structure that we've created, to be more compassionate and to be more flexible, to allow folks and to encourage folks to enter, re-enter, and experience different aspects of the workforce.
So I know you've got to get back because there's votes. So one final question. What's the one thing you want small businesses to know about how you and your colleagues in Congress are working to support them?
We understand you. I think that this is, sometimes small businesses and every citizen thinks that unless you've got a big paycheck or a large lobby group, you're the ones being listened to. The largest economic or business lobby group is the small business community. They just are unable to speak in a single voice. And so I will say, knowing this new Republican majority, I say that because that's what we are, and the members of this particular committee, we get and understand the need to have small businesses listened to and heard. We understand the SBA is one of those institutions that is either overwhelmed or incapable of meeting some of the demands. And by the way, is changing policy, 7(a) loans, et cetera, that really are going to undermine the ability to be effective with small businesses. We hear them, we understand it, and we want to listen to you to identify the barriers so that we can make it easier for small businesses to grow. I want small businesses to become big businesses, and that's the most sustainable economic development we can have.
Great. Well, Congressman, thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time to come down here today.
Happy to. Thank you.
We will soon release a report about small business administration modernization, so keep an eye on that. And thank you to Shopify for a lovely event. This was really a good conversation with both you and your colleague. And so thank you all for attending, and thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks.
That was great. Yeah.